Thank you, Clara. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the Darien League of Women Voters, I'd like to welcome Secretary Merrill back to the town of Darien. Whenever we call, you come, so thank you very much. We appreciate your generosity with your time. In recognition and in celebration of the League's 100th anniversary and the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, our program theme this year is Women Using Their Power to Create Change. Today, we're fortunate to hear from a woman who, during her career, has always stepped up to lead change, whether it was as a state representative or as majority leader, and now as Secretary of the State. Election integrity has been at the forefront for the last several years, and it is my privilege to introduce Connecticut Secretary of State Denise Merrill to discuss how, in the state of Connecticut, we are maintaining the integrity of our elections. Secretary?
Thank you. Thank you so much. I hope you don't mind if I clutch my coffee. I had a harrowing ride down. So, well, you know, I mean, it always is, let's face it. But we did take lots of back roads, and I'm very pleased to be here. So, thank you for inviting me. I have spoken to many of the leagues over the years. I'm not sure I've ever spoken to the Darien League, come to think of it. But I'm an old league member myself. I was on the state board in the 1980s before I came into office as the voter service person. So I was interested even then. And people don't realize, but I started my career actually, I worked on a little project at the Secretary of State's office called the Consortium for Law-Related Education, because I'm both a lawyer and a teacher, and those two things kind of married each other when I started writing curriculum. My real passion in life is civic education and the lack thereof, which we're seeing now the results of, I believe, because for many years, civic education has not been taught very robustly in the schools because it's not on the test. And so we've gone to much more skill-based kind of education, and so as a result, people are appallingly ignorant about our government and about international affairs and other kinds of government. So, so that's my real joy in life, is the projects I can still do through my office with schools. And we do have something called Red, White, and Blue Schools, where we recognize schools that do community service and projects with kids K through 12. My real concern is elementary school, because they do teach some government and law and so forth in the high schools, but you know, those little stories they used to teach about George Washington chopping down the cherry tree and all that sort of thing, they don't tell those stories so much anymore. So anyway, that's just a little aside to show you where I'm coming from. And I consider 2020 to be what we used to call a teachable moment in America, because it's not only 2020 the election year of a president, a very contentious time in our history, but it's also, of course, the 100th anniversary of the right for women to vote, the passage of the 19th Amendment. And, you know, when I think about it, it was the greatest expansion of democracy in the history of the country. 30 million people, and that's us, suddenly got the right to vote. I mean, it's astonishing when you think about it. And when you think about the fact that they had to convince all the men to let them do it. So how did they do that? It's a really interesting story. And of course, I'll talk in a minute about the commission we've put together to try to educate all of us about how that really went down. It was an incredible political effort. I think really women kind of invented lobbying through that whole thing. And it's an amazing story. I would recommend one book to you called The Women's Hour by Elaine Weiss, I believe. I just read it, and you know, I'm a big reader. We're going to have a book club, actually, an online book club for the centennial. But I was expecting it to be rather dull, quite frankly, you know, kind of a history. It's not. It's a gripping story with all kinds of drama, and it's a wonderful story. So I'd recommend it to all of you. So let's talk about voting, where we are today. And, you know, I'm in a place that I never thought I'd be, quite frankly, since the 2016 election, primarily related to the kinds of attacks we're seeing on our voting system, if you can call it a system, our elections. In 2016, I was the president of the National Association of Secretaries of State. This is our nonpartisan group of secretaries, and we talk a lot about election process and, kind of mundane things in a way. But I was called on in 2016 to explain the fact that Russians had, I don't want to use the word hacked because that sounds like something actually happened. They were probing our voter lists, the registry where when you register to vote, you're on a statewide list in every state now. It did happen in Connecticut. It took us a while to extract the information from the Department of Homeland Security because you run into this really weird situation where none of us knew about it. And so how can you do anything about it if you don't know about it? So the first thing we were told in a congressional hearing was, well, 21 states have been probed by these foreign Russian agency IP addresses. And so what's my first question? Well, was it Connecticut, right? And they said, sorry, we can't tell you because it's top secret, So that's where we started with all this security concern. We've come a long way, I'm happy to report. We did establish a committee, a nationwide committee with secretaries of state who generally are charged with administering elections, and the Department of Homeland Security, FBI, CIA, other agencies. And now we have a pretty good communication system. So if something happens, and by the way, it's happening all the time. It has not stopped. We're still getting probed by all kinds of things. Just to give you an idea, our voter list, which is housed at the Secretary of State's office, or really at our IT, the state's IT department, is probed about 1 million times a day. So it's sort of a needle in a haystack in a way, although these computer people can figure a lot of this out. They can tell where these probes are coming from. But so I'm starting to learn more about IT and security, and my job now is to instruct our local administrators, who are the ones who really administer elections, the registrars and the clerks, on how to make their own processes more secure. It is an enormous challenge, I will tell you right now. So the IT department in my office has firewalls, all the kinds of things you have on your own computers, and so we're doing pretty well. Nobody got in. We don't even know really why they were doing it. But what's become apparent, and by the way, I now have my security clearance, so they can actually tell me when things go wrong. I never thought I'd have security clearance in my lifetime, but here I am. The security is not only better, and we are using all kinds of new products produced by the federal agencies that are helping us secure our system, but the voter file has one drop point in each town. It's really not on the internet per se. It's an old-fashioned, what they used to call a closed loop system. So it's not like anybody can get in even if they have a password. But there is one place, probably in your town hall, where the list is managed. And there are other computers coming off of that, but the registrars are the only ones, and sometimes the clerks, that can go into that system and change names. So why is this important? Because you're seeing across the country that there are different people in different states that can actually go in and take names off the list. And how that occurs is heavily regulated by federal law. You can imagine why. Because who votes determines who wins. And these things can be manipulated. And it's our job now to make sure that outside forces, domestic bad actors, or foreign, cannot penetrate our systems. And as you know, there have been many hacks. Target, banks, everywhere, and now towns. I don't know if you've heard about the recent spate of towns being hacked, which causes absolute havoc because, think of it, shutting down your town, you shut down your tax system, you shut down your schools. I mean, it happened to 2 towns now already in Connecticut, Middletown and Wolcott, that I know of, and I'm sure there may be more. And they're asked for ransomware, and people get in, shut down your system, and then ask for money. So it's a very serious issue, particularly in elections, because we don't have a lot of slack. If you're a bank and you have, let's say, an ATM machine, and someone goes to get money out of your ATM machine, well, the bank knows who you are and you know who the bank is. And the banks build in 5% for fraud and abuse. We can't do that in elections, can we? We have to have a very, very accurate system. And that's because the most important thing, to me at least, is maintaining the faith of the public in our elections. And honestly, for at least 100 years, I believe Americans have had faith in their elections. You've not seen a lot of challenges to the results of elections in this country. Once in a great while. We all remember the hanging chads of 2000. But when it's resolved by the courts and everyone accepts the results. I think we're now in a new world. I think people are going to be very skeptical of the results because of all this talk, because of all the questions about Russians probing systems, and also the most difficult campaign that's going on to deal with is not the computers. It's the campaign of disinformation, which is being funded to the tune of billions of dollars by Russians, Chinese, Iranians, who knows what other countries. And these are all the fake websites and the things we're seeing now in elections of sites that imitate, for example, my site. So my website is sots.ct.gov. We'll see a website that'll be sots.ct.com or something similar. You go to that site and it will tell you to go to the wrong polling place, for example, or it will tell you that you're registered when you're not, or all kinds of disinformation. A lot of it is targeted at candidates and other things, just to make you generally distrustful of elections and the people running in them. All kinds of really nasty, false information about candidates and so forth. I'm sure you've heard about all this, but now we're going to be living it in a procedural way. And so all these things conspire to make Americans very, very dubious right now about elections on top of everything else. And that really greatly worries me about the 2020 election. So, what are we doing about it? Virtually everything we can. First of all, my job is to make sure everybody understands the results, the tabulators where you vote, they're not connected to anything, anywhere in the country. Even though you hear about voting machines that are touch screens and have no ballot, paper ballot, which we do, of course, and I'm very happy to have that paper ballot because it gives people trust, because we can audit it afterwards, which we do. Connecticut follows all the best practices. We have paper ballots. We have an audit after the fact of a randomly drawn number of precincts. We have something called the Yukon Voting Center, which tests all. The only thing electronic in our tabulator is a little card that reads your ballot. Those are tested both before and after by the computer science department at Yukon. We have a really unique partnership here in Connecticut. Nowhere else in the country has that kind of partnership with an academic institution. They test the programming to make sure it's programmed properly. So we have lots of checks and balances. I'm afraid it is not exactly true in every other state, but in general, no tabulator is connected to the internet. So there's no way, I can't even imagine trying to hack our election in terms of the ballots, because we have 750 polling places, 169, mostly small towns, doing the work of administering the election, and nothing's connected to the internet that you vote on. So I want to make sure I remind people that we are relatively safe from that kind of a hack. It's the old thing, we know the enemy and he is us. because it's the disinformation that we have to tackle. And that's a much more difficult thing to do in a free society. So we'll be trying to come up with ways to make sure that the public is educated about all this. So that's the first thing we're doing. The second thing we're doing is training of local officials. And that's proving to be quite a challenge, because in many towns, the registrars only come in maybe once a week. Some of them don't even know how to use computers very well. And so we're having to do a lot of work making sure they understand that it's really important to change your password. For example, don't give it to other people. Don't open phishing emails. All these sort of basic things. We did get a grant of $5 million to upgrade some of our equipment, but we know that some of our towns are still running computers using Microsoft 7, which is pretty old and no longer supported. So we are instituting something we call a virtual desktop, which will kind of override their systems and update. Everybody will feed into a Microsoft 10 system that we will basically be able to control. For those of you who know anything about all this. I'm learning fast. I'm still a neophyte, but I'm finding that it's just terribly important that we all begin to understand how this all works. And we're doing some other, we're having training sessions, we're bringing in national people, but I think for me the biggest challenge is at the local level, because it's our job. My office, I think it's a kind of misunderstood office in many ways, and I'm sure you've seen what's gone on in Bridgeport the last few weeks, and that's a sample case of exactly why people misunderstand exactly who's in charge, who's the disciplinarian here. And that's because local officials in general, the registrars, are elected officials. And that presents a very special set of questions, which is when something goes wrong, where's the accountability? And I think it's a very good question. And by the way, things always go wrong. There are mistakes made all the time. It's just rare that it becomes meaningful in the results of the election. So most elections aren't that close. It's just when you get to these very close elections, everyone starts questioning everything. So my office helps the local officials follow the law, basically. My elections division is 12 people, 3 attorneys, 5 election officers, and a couple of clerical staff. So clearly we're not going to be running around to polling places and making sure everything's going right, because we have 750 of them. So our job is to answer questions and help local officials follow the law. And it's a heavily regulated area, because the legislators that passed the laws, and I was one of them, so I know, the legislators got there through elections. They all know everything they think about elections, and they come from whatever kind of town they're from, whether it's a city or a very small town. So there's lots and lots and lots of laws about what you can and can't do in elections. And you're seeing that play out right now in Bridgeport. So the real disciplinarian in the scenario is the Election Enforcement Commission. It is a nonpartisan or bipartisan group of people who are appointed. There's equal number of Democrats and Republicans and some independent people, and they are charged with investigating anything that occurs that comes to their attention, mostly through my office. I can recommend that they go investigate something. That's kind of my role, as can any citizen. Any citizen that sees something that they think is illegal going on in a polling place can file a complaint. Part of the problem is, of course, all that work is done after the fact. So with elections, it's over. And someone has won and someone has lost, and someone's questioning that for whatever reason. And then, so it's very difficult to pick up the pieces afterwards. And all they can do is they can fine people. The courts are the only ones that can order a new election. And so if there is evidence, a candidate or a campaign can go to the courts and say, something happened, it wasn't fair, whatever the thing was. And that's what's going on in Bridgeport right now. The candidate, Merrill Moore, who did not prevail, is going to the court and asking for them to overturn the election. She would have to have some pretty strong evidence of something before the court would do that, is my guess, but it's in court right now. My office can't do any of that. Our job is to file a complaint if we hear a problem. On election day, I do have a program with about 100 attorneys throughout the state that I can send in if someone calls our office, and we have a hotline on election day. If someone calls our office and says, someone is illegally voting, for example, I know that because I heard them say something, whatever it is. We can deploy an attorney to go in and ask some questions. They would still have to report back to us, and they couldn't actually do anything because the vote goes on no matter what. That we have learned over several years now of emergencies that have happened. I'm sure you always remember the hurricane in 2011. We had a massive storm. There were trees down and polling places were closed. You know, we've had to deal with a lot of that up here. And so we do have emergency plans now in place. Every town, every registrar and clerk are supposed to have an emergency plan so they know what to do when the lights go out, or, you know, or if they run out of ballots, as happened in Bridgeport in 2010. They didn't run out of a few ballots, they ran out of 20,000 ballots. Honestly, they could have fixed that. There was something they could do. They can go in the back room and start copying ballots and stamp them and certify them and use them. The problem was it was after hours, nobody could find the key to the copy room, the janitor had gone home, and so what did they do? They closed the polling places. They just said, I'm sorry, we're out of ballots, bye. That was not what they were supposed to do. So now I think we've all come a long way. We have these emergency plans that they're supposed to update. They now have cybersecurity involved as well. So we do have a lot of checks and balances in Connecticut. I don't think it's true in all other states, I'll be honest. And I think that is greatly concerning, especially those states like parts of Pennsylvania, I believe Georgia, Louisiana, several other states are still using touchscreen tabulators with not even a receipt. They're trying hard, I think, to replace them as quickly as they can, but it won't be in time for the 2020 election. That's a concern. And there are other concerns like that. Not all states are as careful as we are. But on the other hand, we don't have counties, so it's a really difficult thing to administer 169 towns because you can't know what's going on in every one of them. And let me just say a word about what Gwen just said about this whole issue of what is voter fraud. It's been an issue in this country only in the last 10 years. You know, since 1965 and the Voting Rights Act, things were pretty settled in this country. I remember being surprised that anything was coming up at all because I thought it was sort of a settled question. And then suddenly in 2010, you started hearing of states passing onerous laws about voter IDs. So just to be clear, and I know this is the league, you guys probably follow this a lot more than the average person, but in Connecticut, we've had a voter ID law for 25 years or so. And I still remember when it came in because I remember people started asking them, I'm from Mansfield, Stores, a little place called Yukon up there. And so I was a candidate at the time, and I still remember people would come in and the poll workers would ask them for their driver's license, and they'd say, Marge, you've known me for 30 years. Why are you asking me for my license? This is ridiculous. So people were really angry at first about it. And we got over that, and through the years, people now know that they can be asked for an ID. But the difference is, in Connecticut, we're a little bit flexible about that because if someone's on that voter list and they're registered to vote, we just want to make sure it's the same person, right? So you can produce a number of other things besides a driver's license because only about 60 or 70% of the population have driver's licenses. And by the way, that's dropping because a lot of young people don't get driver's licenses so quickly anymore. But anyway, so if you don't have a driver's license with you, or even if you forgot your whole wallet at home and you have nothing with you, but you swear up and down you're the person on that list, we let you fill out an affidavit and vote in case, it can be used in case it comes to a close vote, right? In these other states, they started passing laws that were very, very specific about exactly what ID you needed. One example is Texas, where they passed a law saying you had to have a photo ID. Now, personally, I think the photo thing is a bit of a red herring, because how many of us really look like that photo, But whatever. So they passed a photo ID, and then they listed the things you could use as a photo ID. So among the missing on that list were student IDs. Even if they had pictures, couldn't use it. But you could use your gun license if it had a photo ID. So you can see it's pretty subtle. It can be very subtle. In Kansas, they went even further. They passed a law saying you have to have citizenship papers to vote. Everybody. That is now in the courts as an overly burdensome requirement in order to vote, because you have to remember, anyone who's 18 and a citizen has a right to vote. It is not a privilege, it's a right. And so you cannot keep putting things in place that impede that right. And that's the crux of the argument. I think there are people that think that it's a privilege to vote, not a right, and that you have to somehow earn it. And that has been the debate. We've seen it even here in Connecticut. So that's the basis of all the claims about voter fraud. The word fraud is used to cover a vast amount of ground. In your mind, when you think voter fraud, what do you think of? Somebody who's not supposed to be voting, maybe impersonating somebody, like coming in and saying, oh, I'm really this guy on the list, and let me vote, So impersonating somebody, that's definitely fraud. I have never seen it. The instances of that being even brought up are so rare that one researcher, his name is Rick Hasson, said you have much more chance of being struck by lightning than impersonating a voter. It just doesn't happen. The other thing everybody thinks about are what? People who are undocumented trying to vote. Well, first of all, in my mind, I'm thinking, I'm an undocumented person. Am I going to go try to vote? It seems pretty crazy to me, because you're going to get caught, right? So the whole premise, I think, is extremely questionable. But even if you think there's some sort of conspiracy that undocumented people are trying to sway our election in some way, I think it would be very difficult to pull off. First of all, we have had people that have called and said, I know that this person tried to vote and I know she doesn't have citizenship. We do have people attest to citizenship when they register, and it's brought to their attention very clearly, and the penalty is a $5,000 fine or a year in jail. It's a very serious felony. But ever since we've done the registration at the DMV, which is now an amazing success, we have registered more people to vote in this state than ever before, by the hundreds of thousands. We had 200,000 new voters in the last 2.5 years here, which is amazing. And, by the way, when they register at the DMV, they spell their own names, so they get spelled right, they have the right street on them, you don't have nearly the number of mistakes, and people, if they move, they change their address. So our lists right now are better than they've ever been, for that reason alone. On the other hand, I'm very worried about people inadvertently registering to vote if they are undocumented or have a green card or something like that, because, it's a very serious penalty. So we've been very, very, very careful when we register people to vote at the DMV. The whole, I know you can get a license in Connecticut, I forget what we call it, but that even if you're not a citizen, you can get a driver's license. It's a completely separate database. It never connects with our voter list at all. I mean, this is just to assure you, we are taking every measure we can for people's protection, to make sure that whoever's registering to vote is a proper voter. So all this has happened really since 2010. We never felt called upon to take all these extra measures to make sure someone's an actual legal voter. To my mind, the biggest problem we have in this country is people aren't voting enough. You know, we've got a real problem with not just apathy now, but actual indignation out there against government and against even voting for government. I mean, it's a very big worry. We should all be very concerned. The good news is, of the 200,000 new voters we got in the last year or two, 92,000 of them were between the ages of 18 and 24. Fascinating. It's the first time I've seen this in all the years I've been doing this. Reminds me of how I came into politics really in the 70s, motivated by what? Vietnam War, the environment. I grew up in California, and those were the concerns then. This whole generation, they're coming to life, and I couldn't be happier. It's about time, I would say. And they are interested, they're engaged, and they are really starting to come out of the woodwork and want to be civically engaged. And I think it's up to all of us to make sure it happens and to invite them in instead of, you know, trying to pull up the ladder. We should be making sure these young people get heard. It's their world, and they're going to inherit it from us. So I think we are obligated to make sure they understand how these things work and why they work the way they do. So I'm going to stop there. I know there may be more questions, and I'm happy to have a conversation about anything you'd like. I think, Yvonne, you asked me to talk about challengers. Do you still want me to talk about that? Was that some question somebody had? Okay. Anyway, I'll stop there. Thank you very much for being here. I love the opportunity to tell people about all this. So, thanks.
Can I just follow up on what you said about the DMV, how you go to, you know,
Register.
strong measures to make sure that people who are undocumented don't mistakenly register to vote. Do you actually train your employees with a protocol of questions, specific documentation?
Yes, it's
How
all.
does that take place?
Yes, right now we're in the second phase of a three-phase phase-in, and we're still doing it somewhat on paper, but what we will have is a screen, just like you do in many places now, a VeriSign thing, and it asks very specific questions in a very specific order. And like all of these things, if you answer one thing, you won't be able to go any further, and that's true now. So that's one way, and as I said, the whole issue of undocumented, which by the way is a complete red herring. There's just no documented evidence that this is going on. And so it's infuriating to me that we all kind of say, oh yeah, maybe we ought to do more about that. So just with that caveat. But we have decided we have to assure people, above all, that this is a fair system and it's working the way it should. So that's why we're doing all this. Not because we think there's a great incidence of this. But yes, it is a separate database. What happens when you register at DMV is you go in and you say, I want to get a license, or whatever you're doing there. They say, you appear to be eligible to vote. Would you like to register? And sometimes people say, well, I'm already registered. And the clerk will say, well, you know, maybe have you moved? You know, do you want to update your record in any way? If you say yes, then they give you, right now, they'll type it in for you, and it goes into their system because you're already, you know, there with your name and address and so forth. They will then, and now this is all only if you have a Connecticut license, first of all. You can't really use the system without it. We're working on other ways to do it, but right now it's only if you have a license. So then it interfaces with our, it checks your signature. That's the important part about DMV. They have a registry of all the signatures from your driver's license. So we can check the signature against the driver's license signature, and then it sends it electronically into the voter registry, which goes to the local level. The registrars, you are not registered until the local registrar actually accepts that registration and mails you a card.
I have a quick question. So 1 or 2 weeks ago, my high schooler registered to vote on voter registration day. She's 17, she'll be 18 in May.
Yes.
So she'll be eligible to vote in 2020. How does that work? Like, how will that work for her next year? I'm like trying to figure out how she's registered to vote now, but can't vote in November.
Right.
Like how? I'm not quite sure I understand registering her over a year in advance.
Actually, I'm not, she should be 17 and a half by the next election, which is November. So she's not 17 and a half by the next election, then,
She'll be 18 in late May, so no, in early November.
oh, you're talking about next year,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
oh, gotcha, okay. Oh, yeah, I mean, there'd be a flag on her name, and then she'd be added to the voter list, because she's registered now.
Right.
We're the registrars. We took your child's application last week. She was so excited.
Okay, there you go.
So excited. She's an adult now. She's gonna pay part of the mortgage too.
She will be able to vote in the primaries next year because she'll be 18 by the election, by the federal election. So she'll be able to vote in the April primary and
Right.
if we have an August primary. That's just the law. 17-year-olds in Connecticut who are turning 18 by the November election can vote in the election.
In the primaries too,
primaries.
yeah, yeah,
We have her in a special place right now in our
Right.
office.
yes. Safe and warm,
And just following the law.
right. Yeah, that's right.
She'll be
That's exactly
added-
right.
She'll be added to our list
Yes,
next year.
good. Hi, registrars. Nice to have you. Yes, go ahead.
You mentioned that the state of Connecticut has its own set of best practices for voter registration and administration. What are those based on? What organizations or research are you doing to set them for Connecticut?
Well, I mean, they've been established over time, mostly by our national association has a set of best practices that they recommend. There are also best practices in cybersecurity now, and that's recommended by something called the Election Assistance Commission, together with something called NIST, National Institute of something. Anyway, cyber people are involved also, and have been, not just cyber, but actually when the states started going to electronic registries, really probably about 20 years ago, Connecticut had, I think, the first electronic voter registry developed by a company called PCC, who still is with us. That's when there started to be standards developed, electronic standards and requirements for those systems. And they're still being hashed out by this EAC is the federal agency that after the 2000 election was set up to deal with problems like this and questions like this. In terms of the other best practices, they've sort of developed, and they're different in every state in a way, because our state has registrars and clerks. Most states have a county clerk that is charged with doing the work, and a board of elections, for example. New York has that system where there's a nonpartisan board of election that decides disputes and that sort of thing. So I would say they've developed over time, and especially since 2000, where we started having all these questions about what kinds of requirements would be needed for something like, right now we just developed an election management system, we call it EMS, and because it was so cumbersome to upload the results of every little town I was getting the results on paper napkins faxed to us, 2 days later and that sort of thing. Well, in our society today, we expect a little more timely access to the results. So we developed an electronic system where the local registrars can input everything in advance, including the ballot, the candidates, and all that is all done now electronically. But we still do not allow them to upload electronically. Now, different states are different. Some states allow their local officials to upload the results from the tabulators. We consider that insecure. So, like I say, we have the advantage of having this computer science department team up at UConn helping us develop those best practices around electronics. As far as the rest of it, it's kind of developed over the years, I think, almost as common sense, a lot with citizen input. This idea that we audit the ballots afterwards, 5% of the precincts now, that came out of the same recommendations when we had the Help America Vote Act in 2002. A lot of those best practice recommendations came out of that. Yep.
What is your comment on the Bridgeport mayoral election results?
My comment on the results. Well, first of all, I would echo what has been said. There's a lot of pejoratives being used about absentee ballots. I am someone who believes that anyone should be able to get an absentee ballot who wants one. An absentee ballot vote is just as good as any other vote. Controls, obviously, are needed, but I would point you to a state like Oregon, which does entirely vote by mail, as do about 5 states now. And what happens there is if you voted in the last election and you're on the list, you get mailed a ballot. You can fill it out, you can consult anybody you want, and you mail it back. And it's almost like, and here in Connecticut, some of those things are actually a crime. So it's like a difference between an SAT fill in the bubble test where you can't consult anything and you're trying to write things on your wrist, and an open book test. They treat it more like an open book test. If you want to consult with somebody, or even if somebody tries to harass you into voting for somebody, well, you need to decide who you're going to vote for on your own. So that being said, and I have introduced several times the idea of what we call no-fault absentee ballots. We are a real outlier. I think there are only 2 states left that require you to have an excuse to get an absentee ballot. But it is the law. And you do need an excuse, and you do need to at least say or think you're going to be out of town on election day or unable to get to the polls to get an absentee ballot in Connecticut. Now, the question is, they're questioning the number of absentee ballots, and it is definitely a tactic used by many campaigns in almost every town, frankly, to try to make sure that, for example, the students who just graduated get their absentee ballot and remember to vote. That was done routinely in my town. In fact, I think the registrars used to mail applications. That's the other thing. I would want to see a lot more proof and actual evidence of these things that went on. So far, I see little actual evidence beyond what we saw in the paper, which were the testimony of various people who said, this happened to me, that happened to me. Someone pressured me to try to vote. I didn't ask for an absentee ballot, but it got mailed to me. Sometimes people get confused about applications for absentee ballots versus the ballots themselves. So I would want to know a lot more about whether those were applications that were mailed to them or actual ballots. Now, I'm not questioning their veracity, but there could be confusion, and that's why we're sending investigators down to find out what really happened. As far as people in the public housing areas, that to me is the most disturbing thing. I think the kind of voter intimidation that appeared to be going on is extremely troubling. That is a crime. We're no longer even talking about election law here. And so I think that is the most troubling thing of what I heard that went on. Yes, we have had other complaints in Bridgeport. They ran out of ballots, which we already talked about. I think it was just last year there were complaints about the party chair collecting absentee ballots and with a policeman that he appeared to direct from his restaurant. I mean, it gets, but these things are all within very slim boundaries of the law. And so that's the thing that has to get sorted out. What actually happened? And there have to be sworn statements. You can't just assume that things went on just because things are said in the paper. But I felt it was enough to file a complaint with the Election Enforcement Commission. But again, the real problem is, how do you stop this permanently? And if these go beyond routine tactics of campaigns and candidates trying to win, and they try very hard, and they'll pull out all the stops. It's just like we have to monitor the 75-foot rule from the polling place, because as you know, if you're in a tough race, I don't know what goes on down here, but I know in many towns, you have to wade through the candidates to get to the polling place, and they're trying to hand you little cards and saying, vote for me. It has to be done outside the 75-foot line. But even then, I know a lot of people find it very annoying. It's that old free speech thing, you can only limit political speech within very broad boundaries. So that is the line we have drawn in Connecticut, 75 feet. And it's pretty rigorously enforced in most places. And some of the biggest complaints we get on election day is, somebody's inside the 75-foot with a hat on or whatever. So that's the reason for all that. But I don't know, frankly, what went on in Bridgeport. I don't know if it crossed those lines, but I'm most concerned about the voter intimidation. Yes?
Can you explain to me a little bit about early voting? I know my sister was in Texas, and it's a piece of cake. You do it
Yes.
all the time.
Yes.
And I don't know if Connecticut will get there, and actually, what does it mean?
Yes, early voting. Basically, early voting, as opposed to absentee ballot voting, means you have more days to vote, more days that the polling places are actually open. We, again, are an outlier. We have no days of early voting. We just have election day, and we have very restrictive absentee ballots. So, for example, in Texas, they have, I think it's 3 weeks. A long time. And other places have, 3 or 5 days, sometimes on a weekend, sometimes not. Florida, for example, has 10 days of early voting, but they only open the polling places that are in libraries and town halls because they're already open, so to avoid the cost. And that's the thing people are most concerned about is, oh, isn't this going to cost a lot of money? And my answer is not necessarily. Depends how you do it. Here, the reason we don't have it really is because we have a constitution. The state constitution says you can only vote on that Tuesday. So that means we have to get a constitutional amendment, which is a really high bar. And I've tried several times. It was actually, we got it on the ballot in 2014, where it said, would you like to have more days of voting, essentially? And it failed. And I think it was because people didn't really understand what it said. Who knows, but it did fail. So now we're trying again with a slightly different constitutional amendment. It did pass the House and Senate this year with 60% of the vote, not enough to get it on the ballot in 2020. But it now has to pass another legislature, which means not this year, but next year, again, in the same form, and then it can go on the ballot in 2022. So, most places have it. We have a lot to look at in terms of how other states handle these things. I think it just gives people more opportunities to vote.
There's been a lot of talk, and I think I've heard New York State talk about this. To have one on a weekend would really give power to an awful lot of people who cannot miss work. And
That's right.
do not vote.
Yes, that's right. Yes. So I have advocated for it for a long time, but it's just really difficult. Honestly, I feel like it's difficult to get anything done anymore. Even here in Connecticut, it's just getting so stuck. Ugh. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about what happened in Stratford in November and why there wasn't a special election?
Stratford. Okay, I'll see if I can remember.
Ballots were given, the wrong
Yes.
ballots were
Oh, yes. Okay, Stratford. So what happened was they were using something that I would say is not a best practice. They were using one tabulator for 2 different precincts. So they had 2 piles of ballots, and people were supposed to get one or the other depending on which precinct they were in, and they were different state rep candidates. They ran out of one pile, and somebody started giving everybody this pile. That's basically what happened. So we couldn't sort out in the end who got what because there's no names on the ballot. So it was difficult to tell what exactly happened. That's the bottom line. So it was close enough, I guess. There was there a recount? I'm trying to remember. We only have mandatory recounts in Connecticut. You can't say I want to recount because I don't think things were fair. You have to come within, I think it's 0.5%. So a certain number of votes. I don't think it met that test. So there was not a recount. And basically, the election stood because that was the result. The result was one candidate won.
They won by 12, but they threw out the 79 bad ballots that had been given. So
Well, except they never really could tell exactly. I don't know how they got to the 79
bad ballots away, but instead
Oh.
of trying to figure out,
Oh, you
who
mean
those people voted for, they threw them out.
Yeah, bad ballots, you mean in terms of ballots that didn't get counted? Oh, well, see, how could they have told? I never could figure out how they could even tell how many ballots were for the wrong candidate. I guess there must have been some way they extracted that number. Anyway, it went to court, right? I think, as I recall. Anyway, it was a big mess because nobody could figure out exactly what happened. essentially.
I think
And
it had a special election, right? Was that discussed?
that it was thrown to the General Assembly, to the House, because the House is the only one that can decide who to seat in their assembly. So that's why the House became the arbiter of the situation. And so the House, and of course that seems really unfair because of course the House is primarily Democratic. So of course they decided to sit the member who had technically won the election but was a Democrat. So that felt unfair, but that's unfortunately what the rules say. The law says that the House is the one that has to decide who they can seat as a member. So it ended up getting thrown to the House, and I forget all the steps along the way, but it's still very much resented by people because they don't think it's fair. They think there should, but see, then there was another question, now I'm remembering it, question about special election, because what are you going to do? You're going to have a special election just for that precinct, or those two precincts, or the whole town, and what does that look like? So it really got very convoluted, and in the end, that's why it went to the House to decide. And so now, everybody will get a chance to decide again, right? Because there'll be another election. But a special election, they decided not to hold, and I can't remember, I don't know if it was the courts that said that, or because the law threw it to the House. I suspect it's the latter. Sorry, I can't remember more than that. By the way, I get taken to court at least 6 times a year on various things. The most recent problems that I'm encountering, and I think we need to fix in Connecticut, is this issue about petitioning candidates. More and more, our system was set up for 2 parties, basically. And the laws are very complicated when it comes to petitioning on the ballot. Again, you're seeing that play out in Bridgeport, where the candidate who lost also attempted to get on a second line on the Working Families Party line, so that she'd still be on the ballot even if she lost the primary. Well, first of all, the law doesn't favor that second bite at the apple to begin with. It's deliberately difficult to get on either as a cross-endorsed candidate or as a write-in candidate. You have to get a significant number of signatures. She didn't get the right amount of signatures, but the problem is the way the system works, they don't find out until the deadline's over. Because most of them bring the signatures in at 4:32, when they're supposed to be in by 5 o'clock that day. So there's no time for us to determine exactly how many signatures there are and then get the information back to them. Deadline's over, too late. So if you miss the deadline the first time, you can't be on the ballot. And that's what happened to Marilyn Moore. She tried to stay on the ballot even though she lost the primary and then didn't get the right number of signatures. I think she was supposed to get 207 and she ended up with 165. Not because she didn't hand in 207, it's just that some of those 207 or whatever she held weren't on the voter list, weren't, who knows, but they were thrown out by the local registrars. Here again, you have suspicion because it's the local registrar. That local registrar might be in some faction or another. Were those signatures really valid? Were they really thrown out for good reasons? And that's the purpose of them mailing them up to us, and we're supposed to just cross-check to make sure the numbers add up. But we don't check for who's on the list. That's a local thing. So it's very complicated, and now she's trying to do a write-in candidacy. Again, you have to get a certain number of signatures, you have to get them in on time, you have to file an endorsement form, and 3 times this year already, people have either, I was in court Monday, forgot to file the endorsement form. They claim, this is a Green Party candidate up in New London, she claimed she mailed it. We never got it, and we have very, very elaborate systems to get our mail. And so we couldn't put her on the ballot because she did not mail in the stupid endorsement form. I mean, it seems very technical, but you have to have the rules. And we have very, very strict guidelines and deadlines on these things. So this all makes people feel it's very unfair that we're being unjust to the third-party candidates and petitioning candidates. The truth is, we're getting more and more of these petitioning candidates. We had 200 petitioning candidates this year onto the ballots for everything from fire commissioner to Board of Education. And so I think this needs a look. I really do, because we've either got to go one way or the other. It's too much burden on the local officials to have to, make sure there's absolutely no room for error. Yes?
The usual pattern of voting results reports in Connecticut is that any number of the smaller towns, maybe say 130, come in early.
Yes, they're small.
Purely because of the fact they're small.
Yes.
The cities seem to take a longer time.
Yes.
Are they sufficiently technology enabled to be able to report sooner, or is it a function of other things besides status of technology?
I think it's a bit of both, honestly. A lot of them do central counting, so that means you have to get everything in from, let's say, 26 polling places. Frequently there are delays at the polling places for one reason or another. And of course they all have to do all the announcing, at the end of the evening. There's a very open process, again, best practices, transparency. We open the machines, everything, they put the tape on the wall so everyone can see it. And then they have to take that tape down. And because we do not allow them to upload the information on those tapes, it takes longer. So here you have the balance between security and speed. Yes?
I think it was last year, a couple of years ago, Florida had an initiative where it was on their ballot to allow people who had finished their prison sentences to regain their right to vote.
Yes.
Where does Connecticut stand on that issue?
We do definitely allow anyone to regain their right to vote if they have done their time and are off of parole. So if you're on probation and you're in the community, you get your right to vote back. Now, I made a proposal this year that we do the same for anyone in the community who has served their time and is back in the community. In my view, if they're in the community, they ought to be able to regain that right. But that bill did not pass. So that would have changed it slightly to allow even those on parole to be able to regain their right. Yes.
Sort of a follow-up to her question, we have heard stories about various localities running out of ballots. You just mentioned Stratford.
Yep.
Is there something your office can do to prevent that? I realize it's by town or by city.
Yeah.
Say New Haven, they get a huge turnout next year, and they haven't, printed enough ballots that would create chaos.
It's a terrible problem, honestly. Our problem is we have no real authority. So we can advise, and we did advise, for example, in New Haven last year, we had a terrible problem with Election Day registration, which is actually a great reform because it enables us to, the biggest problem we have on Election Day is people show up and say, I'm supposed to be on the list, and they're not there. And they get very, very angry when they're not there. And usually, frankly, it's clerical error of some sort. But sometimes it's their fault. Maybe they moved and didn't tell anyone. Now you can go to town hall, register, and vote with the proper identification. In New Haven, what happened was literally thousands of people showed up on Election Day to register and vote. It was chaos, and it was a terrible thing. We had advised them in advance to have at least 10 workstations to get people registered because you could see it coming. We had had problems with the mail at Yale. A lot of the absentee ballots got sent back by mistake. And so we knew there was going to be this tsunami of Yale students coming to vote. They didn't listen, and they didn't do that, and they had 2 stations. And it was a disaster. Now this year, of course, we will go down and make the same point. We have a few more teeth that we can pull out, but it's essentially, and it's locally paid for. See, that's the bottom line. The towns pay for these things, and even though there are lots of laws telling you exactly what you must do, and they generally follow the letter of the law, but these extra expenses, if you will, no one wants to pay for it, and then you end up with a bad result like that. And it's not just in the cities either. The biggest lines we saw one year were in Plymouth, Connecticut, a small town. And it's because they collapsed all their polling places down to 2. They had 4, but they didn't ramp up their personnel. So they ended up with these long lines. People were furious. I keep telling these towns, you don't want to be in the paper for this. This is not good. But, these are management issues, honestly. One year, West Hartford, really upscale town, right? And very politically active. Long lines because they didn't divide their lists properly. They did A to M and M to Z. Well, there were just a whole lot more people in one section than the other. And they also didn't set up their polling places, so they had only one way in and one way out. It was absolutely disastrous. The registrar lost her job. Everybody went crazy in the town. But these are the things that hopefully we can help more with, because we do have people that are experienced. These are these election officers who usually have been registrars themselves and can help people, but they have to listen too, and they have to pay for it. Yes?
So do you think, given all these intricacies and how hard it is, that the public can still have faith that at the end of the day, on election day, when we get the results, our results are as accurate as they humanly can be in a process?
Yes, in Connecticut. I won't speak for anywhere else, but yes, in Connecticut, I think we have a very secure election system. Lots of checks and balances, and lots of people who care, who are the actual poll workers and the moderators and the registrars and the clerks. These people really care about this, and they want to do a good job. So I think that's the bottom line for me.
In Darien, a few years ago, we decided that we'd rather not have elections taking place in schools.
Yes.
And made an effort to have other places in Darien that people could vote. And I wonder if that's becoming a more common practice statewide because of security issues.
Absolutely, and we encourage that very much. It gets difficult when you have referenda and all these other elections, but certainly for general elections, and honestly, that's why I support primaries in the summer, because then you don't have to worry about the closing of the schools. But schools make ideal polling places. There are very few other places in towns that you can meet all the requirements for allowing people the access to the polls. So yes, it's much more common now, certainly since Sandy Hook. And we have recommended that towns close their schools for Election Day. It's kind of sad because I used to love, the kids would see the voting.
Well,
and
that's
I know, it's sad, but the truth is, security is really paramount right now, and unless a school has a completely separate area, and sometimes that's the case, then it would work, but it's not ideal. Yes?
Well, I'm going to cut it off, and thank you for your generous time. Thank you so much. And we'd like to introduce our two registrars are here. So Susan and John, if you would come on up, please.
I don't want to put you
Don't
on the
be
spot,
shy.
but I think a clear takeaway is that the election integrity is in the hands of the local registrars. and we are
Absolutely.
lucky to have them.
Ooh, the pressure.
So you have Susan Gray and John Beatty, who are our registrars.
And we follow every one of the 1,000 laws that Denise.
I just wanted to address the school issue. It's interesting because we do have one school where we have complete outside access and we block off the rest of the school. But the reason we can't have elections in the schools anymore is because there are different laws that require IDs. Different ID requirements to come into a school now since Sandy Hook.
That's right.
Then there are for our election ID laws. Our election ID laws are a little bit more lax, believe it or not, than our school ID requirements now. So if you have been a convicted criminal, you cannot come into the school, but you can come to vote, as you said, if you're not on parole and you've been released from prison. So you can, so we were having trouble with that. We would be liable for, for lots of things if we decline to let someone come into the school to vote. And we have to let you come in to vote if you, are duly registered and you're not a convicted felon.
And I just want to say that Jamie helped us secure an agreement. We've had many superintendents that we've met with, and every time we get a new one, I let them know that they did make an agreement that if we do use a school, we would use a room with a separate entrance. So we do not use a school unless it has a separate entrance, and we actually block off the rest of the school so that they can't go in there. So we do have that agreement, and hopefully all the superintendents will follow that, so.
Or we find more spaces to vote.
And we find more spaces to vote.
Yeah, I mean, we can vote in churches, we can vote in all sorts of places, but right now we're using.
So that like raises, I'm in District 6, and I vote at Town Hall, but so does District 1, I believe. Five. Two.
No, you're.
Anyway, there are two districts voting in
You're
one polling
District
place.
6 and you vote at Leroy.
No, I, Board of Ed. Yeah, Board of Ed,
There's
I'm sorry,
two
not Town Hall,
districts there.
Board of Ed.
Go ahead.
Board of Ed, I voted Board of
You
Ed.
voted
There
Board
are
of
two
Ed.
districts that vote there, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
So is there ever this whole, because if I'm not mistaken, when it comes to the state elections, those two districts are on different sides of town. Like I'm on the Norwalk side of town. I don't know.
There's no problem with any congressional district issue there. We just have two separate tabulators.
I was gonna say, just don't have one
We have two separate
tabulator.
tabulators and two separate poll sites, and we have stanchions that sort of go down, draw a line between. I mean, it would be great to have a bigger space than Leroy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fine for, like, I just wonder how that space is gonna be in the 2020 election. Like, I think it'll be fine this year. But like next year when I think.
It's gonna be tight.
It's gonna be tight, but
The
it,
parking is tight. We've
Yeah.
actually been going around counting parking spots in all of our polling locations. It's gonna be tight.
yeah, the other thing we did in the room, I don't know if you people remember, we have new voting booths. They take up half the room of the old standalone single voting booths. You have 4 voting booths in a smaller space. And it's about 50% less space used, so that will help at 35 Leroy.
There are gonna be lines.
But there are gonna be lines,
We
yeah.
don't have a
This is why we need
guarantee.
early voting.
We don't have a guarantee from our Board of Education that we will close schools on election day.
That's still their right to keep them open, so.
So unless we have that guarantee that's ongoing, we have to keep our elections where we have them. And Hinley School has an outside entrance, so we're able to have it there. And I think one of you asked a question about the illegal immigrants being able to get a license in Connecticut.
No, just undocumented.
Well, they're
That they would not
undocumented.
be, what are the,
So what we
not
have
a concern of
done,
mine, but what are
what
the
we have
safeguards
done,
of
and we're
that?
actually the Secretary of State's office is coming up with a mandatory poll worker training
Yes.
program. And we're gonna send some of our stuff up to you because in the past 2 years, we've been really working on training our election officials. And we have, the checkers are the people who ask for the identification at the elections. We have attached all the different categories of licenses in color, actual enlarged pictures of the licenses. And what you were talking about was the driver's only license.
Yes.
And that undocumented aliens can have, and the reason we let them have a license is because a lot of people were being nannies in Connecticut and they were driving kids around and they were not able to obtain licenses, so they were driving illegally. And I guess their employers never said, do you have a license? So we now have a category at DMV where you can get a license, but as Secretary Merrill said, it's in a completely different database. But someone could show up conceivably on the day of the election with this license, and it's attached to the ID requirements, a DO license, no vote. So we're hoping that we'll get that to other towns will do that, and there won't be so much confusion.
Yeah, you're actually supposed to post the ID requirements right on the desk at
Yeah,
the polling
right, we
place.
do.
I'm sure you do, yeah. So we do everything we can to make sure that people understand. But
the laws are constantly changing, and there's a lot.
yeah, our voter ID law has been very constant. It's been the same thing for 20 years. It's just all these other states are doing all these
Right.
other things, and people are terribly confused about that. You know, they come in saying, well, am I supposed to have a certain ID? And that's what it's designed to do, quite frankly, is to make people nervous about it. And that's what's happened. They're just confused. So,
I think Connecticut, did we used to have a voter ID card?
no, we've
Never?
never had that, no.
Okay.
I don't think so. I mean, not in my memory. I do want to make a quick plug for the commission that we've set up for the celebration next year of the 19th Amendment passage. So I have set up a Centennial Commission. My co-chairs are Annie Lamont and Lieutenant Governor Susan Beisowitz. And we are doing a number of things, so I just wanted to let you know about it because we're hoping that every town does something. And we have some resources that we have gotten together that I want to let you know about. But mainly, of course, we have a website, and we also have a texting platform. See, I have all these new young employees, and they tell me about all this stuff. So you can actually join this texting platform, and we will send you things about what we're doing, if you care to do that. So that's Vote 100 to 474747. Why 47? I have no idea. But so you can join that system. Or we have a whole town suffrage toolkit, the kinds of things you can do. You can give awards, you can look into the history of your town to see if there were ladies or gentlemen who were part of it was a 70-year fight. It was not an easy thing. We all take it for granted now, but between Seneca Falls and the actual passage of the amendment was 72 years. And it went through many iterations. The first 40 years, they were relatively polite. I mean, Susan B. Anthony and that first wave of women who tried to get the vote she did get arrested at one point. She voted illegally. Sure, that wouldn't happen today, but she did vote illegally, and they arrested her and she went to jail, just to make a point. But after that, there was another wave of women who lost patience. It sort of reminds me of today, what's going on in Washington. So this new group of women, young, in their 20s, were radicals. They were like, enough of this being polite stuff. We're not getting anywhere fast enough. So they went to the mats. They went down to Washington and picketed Wilson's White House. They went to jail. They went on starvation diets. They were force-fed in prison. One died. I mean, it was a very violent movement. And that, I think, it's really interesting when you read about it, because I think we've kind of forgotten all that. We think it was just sort of a bunch of nice ladies in white dresses, sort of. There is a wonderful, iconic photograph which just illustrates the point that I made about they were the first media hounds. They were the first lobbyists, because you see this photograph of this massive parade they had down Fifth Avenue in New York. And of course, they're all dressed in white with the banners, and the banners were all different colors depending on your job. So, for example, social workers had one color, teachers had a different color, iron workers had a different color, because women were working in lots of different jobs at that point. And then you see the audience is thousands of people, and they're all men, and they're all in black. So it's a great image, because you see this swath of white going down the street, and then you see all the black hats along the side. That's just an illustration of the kinds of things they did. They got the media thing. They understood that icons and symbols were important, and so there was a lot of that. So, but the leader of the young women, the group that came afterwards, was Alice Paul. She was from Ridgefield, Connecticut. And there were other very, very activist young women in Connecticut who really led the more revolutionary movement in the second wave of feminists. So just a little tidbit. Please go on the website and come up with some things you can do right here in Darien. We're offering there's a big photo exhibit that we will have available, one copy for each town. They're large stand-up posters, and you could put them in schools or your town hall. I'm looking for there's a whole town suffrage toolkit, we call it, with all kinds of different ideas of things you could do here in town. And let me find my website, which is votesforwomensct.com. And there's curricula for schools. We're hoping the schools will all do things. We're working with the Department of Education to do some units on women's rights, women's suffrage. And I hope to talk about what the next 100 years will bring. I think it's something we should all think about. Okay, thanks.
Thank you all for coming. For the league members who are here, please plan to stick around to help get our membership solicitation out. If you are not a member, join us. You've gotten a little touch of the programming that we can offer, and we welcome all members.